In 1930, an entire village vanished. But did this mystery actually happen?
All right, picture this. It's a freezing, desolate November back in 1930. You're standing right on the shores of an isolated, totally ice-covered lake in the remote stretches of the Canadian subarctic. The wind is just howling across the treeless tundra. There are no roads, absolutely no cities anywhere near you, just this massive, gray-blue body of water known as Anjikuni Lake. Well, let's dive right into this. Today in our Explainer, we're digging into one of Canada's most famous and honestly most enduring urban legends. It's the kind of story that has kept people absolutely hooked for nearly a century, sparking all these wild theories, books, and endless internet speculation. But as we're going to see, the real truth buried beneath all that ice and folklore is actually far more profound and, to be honest, far more tragic than any campfire ghost story. Vanished Eskimo tribe gives North mystery stranger than fiction. Now, that is exactly how the world was first introduced to this whole thing. Back in January 1931, the Halifax Herald ran this incredibly dramatic newspaper headline. It was penned by a journalist named Emmett E. Kellier. And, man, the story spread like wildfire. It was syndicated across newspapers all over the globe, totally captivating readers who were sitting comfortably in their cozy, warm homes, completely insulated from the freezing north. The article promised a mystery stranger than fiction, and you know what? It absolutely delivered a masterclass in suspense. It plunged the audience right into this eerie, unsettling atmosphere that just immediately grabbed hold of the public imagination. So the main character of this whole sensational piece was a French-Canadian fur trapper by the name of Joe Lebel. According to the article, Lebel was trekking through the Kivalliq region, working the backcountry northwest of Hudson Bay. He eventually walked into what he thought was a familiar Inuit settlement right on the shores of Anjikuni Lake. The story goes that he'd stayed there before, knew the village, and was fully expecting a warm welcome, a nice hot fire, and some shelter from the bitter cold. But when he called out, nothing. He was met with absolute, unnerving silence. The entire village was completely deserted. And the evidence he supposedly found? I mean, it literally reads straight out of a Hollywood thriller. Lebel claimed to have stumbled upon pots of caribou stew still sitting over long-dead cooking fires. He said he saw unfinished sealskin parkas left half-mended, with the bone needles still sticking right out of the fabric. And get this, rifles were left resting against the tent poles. Now, to anyone actually living in the harsh Arctic, leaving behind your rifle is completely unthinkable. It just doesn't happen. This whole catalog of creepy, frozen-in-time evidence really ratcheted up the tension of the story, because it painted a picture of this incredibly sudden, totally unexplained mass departure. It looked like the villagers had literally just vanished mid-sentence. But then, there's this really chilling detail. Lebel claimed he found 7 sled dogs, except they weren't running free. They were tied to a tree and frozen solid. They had starved to death right there at their leashes. You have to understand, in the brutal conditions of the Canadian subarctic, sled dogs were absolutely vital. They were your transportation and your survival. So abandoning your dogs to starve, that wasn't just unimaginably cruel, it meant you were abandoning your main way of staying alive. For the folks reading this back in 1931, that specific detail basically cemented the idea that something truly terrible and maybe even supernatural had gone down at Anjikuni Lake. And actually, to top it all off, the final, most terrifying discovery Lebel supposedly made was right on the outskirts of the camp. He reported finding an exhumed grave. But it wasn't just haphazardly dug up. The stones circling the burial site were perfectly intact, totally undisturbed. Now, Lebel, being an outdoorsman, claimed this proved it absolutely could not have been the work of hungry wild animals rooting around. Those undisturbed stones meant it had to be the work of human hands. Or, something else entirely. The desecration of a grave just added this incredibly dark, sinister layer to the whole vanishing act. You know how these things go, right? Over the decades, the single, wildly exaggerated newspaper article just snowballed into an absolute beast of a myth. It starts with Lebel's 1930 report and that dramatic 1931 newspaper spread, but then jumped to 1959. An author named Frank Edwards decides to feature the story in his book Stranger Than Science, and suddenly, boom, we have reports of mysterious blue pulsing lights in the sky. Fast forward to today, and if you go down the rabbit hole on internet forums, you'll see theories claiming the village inspired sci-fi TV shows, plus wild claims of mass alien abductions, missing organs, ancient curses, the whole shebang. What started as an embellished newspaper story had completely spun out of control into full-blown paranormal folklore. So we really have to ask ourselves, did an entire village actually vanish into thin air? It's a fantastic, spooky story, for sure. But let's wake up from the campfire ghost story for a second. We need to transition into the grounded historical reality here. Because believe it or not, when that story originally hit the presses, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, started getting a lot of questions. And they decided to send an officer to investigate exactly what the heck happened on the shores of that freezing lake. Now, the myth insists that LaBelle was this seasoned, grizzled trapper who intimately knew the village and its people. But the actual administrative records dug up by Sergeant Joseph Nelson during his 1931 investigation, they tell a very different story. Turns out, Joe LaBelle had literally just taken out his very first trapping license that season. He was a total rookie, completely inexperienced. On top of that, Sergeant Nelson actually checked the patrol records and cross-referenced everything with the Hudson's Bay Company traders in the area, and guess what? There was no massive permanent village of 25 people at Anjikuni Lake to begin with. So the official RCMP conclusion was incredibly unambiguous. In their 1931 internal report, they flat out stated there was, quote, no foundation for this story. They found that 0 families were missing. Literally everyone known to use that area was fully accounted for in the subsequent patrols. The frozen dogs, the disturbed grave. There was absolutely 0 corroborating physical evidence for any of it. And to make matters hilariously worse, the Mounties actually discovered that the dramatic photograph published by the newspaper to prove this village existed was pulled right out of their own police archives. It was a completely unrelated photo from 1909. The whole thing was literally just a sensationalized hoax stitched together in a nice warm newspaper office. To truly wrap our heads around what LaBelle probably did see, we need to shift our focus to the true history of the region and the actual people who lived there. The indigenous peoples of the Kavalak region are the Caribou Inuit, specifically bands like the Podlar Mute and the Aher Mute. Now, unlike the coastal Inuit who hunted seals and lived in igloos for most of the year, the Caribou Inuit were completely inland adapted. Their entire economy, their seasonal calendar, their sheer survival, all of it depended entirely on following the massive migrations of the caribou herds. I mean, meat, hide, bone, antler, the caribou provided absolutely everything they needed. And here is where the mystery just kind of falls apart completely. When we deconstruct this fundamental Western misunderstanding of Arctic life, there's nothing supernatural left. The whole myth relies on this idea of a permanent settlement being suddenly abandoned. But the reality of the Caribou Inuit was that they lived in seasonal, highly nomadic camps. So finding an empty camp in November didn't mean aliens had beamed anyone up. It simply meant the band had, moved. They migrated with the caribou to a new hunting ground, or maybe they just walked the 350 kilometers down to trade their furs at the Hudson's Bay Company post at Eskimo Point. Leaving heavy items behind in a camp that you fully intend to return to the next season, that wasn't a mystery. It was just standard, well-documented practice. But while the vanishing village of Anjikuni Lake is pure fiction, the history it ends up obscuring absolutely is not. While readers all around the world were being entertained by this fake paranormal mystery, the actual Caribou Inuit were suffering a very real, heavily documented, and entirely devastating catastrophe. The true tragedy of the Kivalliq region was playing out right in those exact same decades that the myth was gaining popularity. The historical reality from the 1930s through the 1950s for the Podlar Mute and Aher Mute was unbelievably grim. We're talking catastrophic crashes in the caribou populations, and as we just learned, the caribou were their sole source of survival. So this led to severe famine and widespread starvation across the inland territory. Alongside the starvation came the rapid, deadly spread of tuberculosis brought on by European contact. And finally, in the 1950s, the Canadian government initiated forced relocations. They moved the surviving Inuit off their traditional nomadic lands and pushed them into centralized, permanent settlements just to administer welfare. These combined factors totally decimated the populations, reducing them from thousands of people down to just a few hundred. Now look at this, 2019. It wasn't until the year 2019 that the Canadian government formally apologized and finally paid compensation for the forced relocations of the surviving Aher Mute people. Just think about that time frame for a second. For nearly 90 years, the world eagerly passed around this made-up story about a vanishing village, tossing in UFOs and ghosts for fun, while the actual devastating history of the people who actually lived on that land was completely ignored. It took almost a century for that real history to be formally recognized and apologized for. Because the honest truth is, these people didn't vanish into thin air. Their descendants are still here. The Caribou Inuit remain today. They live in modern Kavallik communities like Baker Lake, Arviat, Whale Cove, and Rankin Inlet. And perhaps the most striking takeaway from our explainer today, the Inuit have always known exactly what happened to their families. They know the very real history of the famines, the sickness, and those forced relocations. There is no mystery to them at all, just a profound history of incredible resilience and survival against absolutely devastating odds. So, I really want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. Why is it that we so often prefer the thrill of a paranormal ghost story or some wild internet conspiracy about aliens over confronting the actual and sometimes tragic reality of our own history? The legend of Anjikuni Lake is definitely fascinating, but the honest reckoning it requires from us isn't paranormal at all. The real story here isn't about people vanishing, it's about people enduring. I really hope this explainer encourages you to look past those sensationalized headlines and uncover the true, enduring human stories hiding just beneath the surface. Thanks so much for joining me today, and hey, keep questioning what you read.